At the court, they sat me in the cage, whispering, "She looks like a criminal." I walked out free. They stayed inside. That was the sentence I kept repeating in my head that day. Not like a mantra, not like triumph, but like something stuck in my teeth, a fragment I couldn't dislodge. I hadn't expected the cage. I didn't know they still used them. It was made of metal bars, painted the same bureaucratic beige as the rest of the courtroom, but colder. They said it was for my own safety, that it was procedure for cases of this nature, that it wasn't personal. But I'd seen the way they looked at me, the clerk, the bailiff, even the public defender who tried to offer me a paper cup of water like I might forget how to swallow. I was 81 years old and still knew how to sit upright, how to button my own coat, how to balance a checkbook without needing a second opinion. I'd taught high school English for 33 years, raised 2 children, and buried 1 husband. And yet there I was, behind bars, while my son, sat in a suit 2 rows ahead, not once turning his head toward me, as if he might catch whatever it was they thought I had. I live alone now, in a small rental house with chipped paint and an old garden full of lavender I didn't plant, but refused to uproot. It's in a coastal town where no one knows my name unless I tell them. Sometimes I lie and say it's Margaret or Jean or Florence, names no one bothers to look up. Sometimes I use my real name, just to remind myself I still have one. But back then, before the cage, before the court, before the whisper, back when the betrayal was still new, I was someone else entirely. I was a mother who still believed her son loved her. I was a woman who thought old age might bring inconvenience, yes, but not humiliation, certainly not exile, certainly not war. It started so small I almost missed it. The refrigerator began filling with groceries I hadn't purchased, almond milk I didn't drink, protein bars I never opened. My mail was intercepted to help you keep track. My keys disappeared for a day and reappeared with a new keychain that said peace of mind, as if branding made it a gift. I was told gently, then firmly, that I shouldn't drive anymore. Just until we figure things out, Mom. It's not a big deal, but it was. It always is. They start by adjusting the thermostat. Then the medications are reordered in pre-labeled packs. Then the passwords get changed. And before you know it, someone else is answering your phone and smiling as they explain how you don't need to worry about all that anymore. At first, I accepted these things. I told myself they were trying to help. My son, David, always had a brisk way of speaking, efficient, professional, the kind of tone that makes you feel like you're interrupting even when you're not. But I told myself it was just how men get when they have families and jobs and mortgages. His wife, Marlene, was the one who made the real decisions, though. She had that manicured kind of control, the kind where every candle is the same height and the guest towels are folded like origami. She'd begun calling me Martha instead of Mom, sometime after their second child was born. I didn't correct her. I should have. The day they brought up the idea of a medical evaluation, it was framed like a joke. "You're sharper than I am, Mom," David said, laughing that tight accountant's laugh of his. "But you know, Marlene worries. And we just want to make sure we're supporting you properly. There's a lot of scams out there targeting older adults. You wouldn't believe the stories." I nodded. Of course I did. That's what you do when your child speaks to you like a client they're trying not to spook. I agreed to the evaluation. I even wore lipstick that day. I wanted to look competent. Isn't that something? 81 years old, and I still wanted to look competent, like someone who deserves to keep her life. The woman conducting the assessment was young, maybe 30, with perfectly neutral lipstick and an iPad. She asked me to draw a clock. "Any time," she said brightly, as if this was a game. I drew 415. She asked me to spell world backward. I did. She asked who the president was, and I almost laughed. Then she asked if I ever forgot to bathe, or got lost, or misplaced large sums of money. What qualifies as large? I asked. She didn't smile. When I mentioned that I'd helped David with his down payment 5 years ago, she typed something quickly. When I told her I paid my own taxes last year, she asked if I used a calculator. She never asked what books I'd read lately, or if I'd loved anyone. She never asked if I still dreamed, or cried, or hoped. She clicked her stylus and said I seemed mostly functional. A week later, I found out my bank account was frozen. My utility bills were being redirected. The nurse practitioner at my clinic wouldn't refill my prescription until I brought in my new legal guardian. That was the word they used, guardian, as if I'd been orphaned, as if I'd wandered into traffic and needed corralling. I called David. He didn't answer. I left a message. Marlene called back. "It's just temporary," she said. "You weren't responding well to the stress. It's not about control. It's about protection. Protection from what? My own autonomy? My own damn name?" I was served court papers the next morning, a petition for permanent conservatorship on the grounds of cognitive decline. Attached was a declaration with David's signature and statements like, "Mom is no longer able to manage her financial affairs responsibly," and "She has exhibited episodes of confusion and paranoia." I read those sentences slowly, the way you read a language you use to speak fluently. There was a hearing date, 3 weeks out. I had no lawyer. I had no idea what to do. The cage was still weeks away, but I could already feel its shape forming around me. At night, I started talking to myself, not out loud, not in any way they could record or twist into evidence. Just softly, inside my own head, I said, "You are Martha Reynolds Harlow. You graduated magna cum laude. You raised children and planted gardens and once won a teaching award for excellence in instruction. You are not confused. You are not delusional. You are not done." I began to record everything. Not just what they said to me, but how they said it. The way Marlene used the word "we" when she meant "I." The way David started calling my home the property. The way even the nurse at the clinic began to speak slower, as if I were translating from another language. I wrote it down, in longhand, with dates and times. I started making copies of documents I hadn't touched in years, insurance forms, house deeds, birth certificates, Derek's will. I kept them in an old leather folder that smelled like damp paper and old resolve. I didn't know yet what I would do with it, but I knew it was mine, and that mattered. 3 days before the hearing, I received a visit from someone I didn't expect. My neighbor's niece, Camille, a night nurse who used to bring me soup when I had a winter cold. She knocked on my door holding a bag of groceries and said, "I heard about the hearing. Do you need someone to go with you?" I didn't cry. Not then. I just nodded, and she stepped inside. She was the first person who asked me what I wanted, not what I needed, not what was best, but what I wanted. I told her everything. The cage hadn't appeared yet, but the walls were closing in, and somewhere deep in my chest, something small and hot began to stir. Not hope, not yet, but anger. Beautiful, precise, sober anger. The kind that doesn't flare, the kind that sharpens, the kind that doesn't ask for permission. And that's where it truly begins. Not in the court, not in the cage, not in the diagnosis or the paperwork or the lawyer they sent to speak slowly to me. No, it began in my kitchen, over weak tea and a bag of groceries, with a woman who saw me clearly. It began with one question: "What do you want?" And my answer, soft but steady, was this: I want to speak. I want to be heard. I want to be seen. And then, without raising my voice, I added, and I want them to know they made a mistake. The summons arrived folded neatly in a white envelope with blue ink that bled slightly at the edges, as though even the paper was unsure of the weight it carried. I almost mistook it for a donation request from a hospice or one of those newsletters from the Neighborhood Historical Society. It was only when I opened it and read the first few lines that the air in the room shifted. Petition for conservatorship of person and estate. Case number C, V8147. The name below the header was mine, printed in heavy black type like an obituary. Beneath it, in a softer font, as if that might lessen the blow, was the petitioner's name, David Harlow, my son, my only living child, my boy who used to fall asleep on my chest during storms, who I once held against my hip while cooking with one arm and grading student essays with the other, who, at 10 years old, swore he'd build me a house by the sea when he became rich. Now here he was, not with a house, not with an apology, but with a petition declaring me legally incompetent. The supporting statement was stapled to the back, and I read it slowly, sitting at the kitchen table with my glasses perched low on my nose, the way I used to read final essays in June when the school year was ending and my bones were tired but my mind sharp. I scanned the allegations not like a mother, but like a witness being asked to identify a crime scene. He said I'd left the stove on for hours. I hadn't. The knob had stuck, once, but I'd turned it off and called maintenance myself. He said I'd forgotten to pay the water bill 3 months in a row. I had the receipts, each marked paid in red letters. He said I'd been found walking barefoot outside, confused and unable to state my address. That, I knew, was a lie. The only time I'd gone outside barefoot was last spring, when the tulips I'd planted years ago bloomed all at once, and I didn't want to crush them with the heels of my shoes. I remembered the feel of the grass, still cold from morning dew, the way the light hit the petals just so. I remembered everything. There were other claims, more insidious ones, that I'd been isolating, showing signs of paranoia, that I'd yelled at a delivery man and accused a neighbor of spying on me, that I refused to allow family into my home and wouldn't let anyone help. Each sentence was framed with the kind of bureaucratic language that sounds objective, but is soaked in implication. Subject exhibits oppositional behavior. Subject lacks insight into declining condition. Subject may pose risk to self if left unsupervised. My own son had signed these statements, had attached a typed summary with bullet points and timestamps, and submitted them to a court as if he were documenting an unpredictable tenant, not a parent. I turned the page and found an attached report from a private clinician, not my doctor, not someone I had ever met. The report stated that based on available information and a brief phone interview conducted with the subject's family, I was a strong candidate for full conservatorship. Family, in this context, meant Marlene, who had once told me that wearing perfume after 70 was a bit much. It meant David, who now referred to my home as the property. It did not mean me. I don't remember standing up from the table. I don't remember walking to the sink or turning on the faucet. I remember the cold water running over my hands and the silence in the house, the kind of silence that doesn't feel restful but hollow. I remember the birdsong outside my window and the smell of toast still lingering from breakfast, and I remember thinking, so this is how it happens. Not with a single violent act, but with paperwork, with neatly typed lines and certified envelopes and signatures that once kissed your cheek goodnight. I sat back down and reread the line that made my stomach turn. The proposed conservator requests temporary and permanent authority over all financial, medical, and residential decisions, effective immediately, due to the subject's impaired cognitive function and inability to safely manage independent living. Effective immediately. That was the phrase that turned everything solid into vapor, because it meant this wasn't just a threat or a plan. It was already in motion. I reached for the phone and dialed David's number. Heart pounding, breath shallow in a way I hadn't felt since the night I stood in the emergency room as Derek's heart monitor flatlined. It rang twice before going to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. I tried again, voicemail. The third time, I left one. Not angry, not desperate, measured. David, I said, I got the papers. I don't understand. Please call me. I waited an hour. Then two. It was Marlene who finally called back, voice flat as a hotel receptionist. Martha, we understand this is confusing, but it's really for the best. You haven't been well. I asked her to explain what she meant by not well, and she said, there's no need to get defensive. I asked why they hadn't spoken to me before going to court, and she said, we tried. You just weren't in a place to hear it. I hung up without replying. I don't remember if my hands were shaking. I do remember staring at the kitchen window, the streaks of dried rain across the glass, and thinking how incredible it was that betrayal could be so quiet, so civil, so dressed in good intentions that you almost thanked them for it. The next morning, I woke to find my debit card declined at the pharmacy. I asked the clerk to run it again, and she did, apologetically, twice. Nothing. I called the bank, and after a series of robotic menus and long holds, a polite voice told me my account had been placed under temporary supervision, pending legal review. By whom? I asked. By your designated representative, the voice replied. I hung up before I said something that might be used against me later. That afternoon, a man I didn't know knocked on my door. He was in his 20s, wore a windbreaker with the court's emblem on it, and held a folder with my name on it, like it was a receipt. Just need to verify you received notice, he said, not unkindly. I stared at the folder, then at him. Do I look like someone who doesn't open her mail? He blinked, clearly unsure whether to laugh. Ma'am, I'm just here to witness. I signed the paper, handed back the folder, and closed the door gently. I didn't cry. I wish I had. Tears would have been a relief. Instead, I stood in the hallway staring at the rug. The same rug David spilled grape juice on when he was 5. I'd scrubbed the stain out with salt and club soda and a toothbrush. It had never fully faded. Now it stared back at me like a witness. You gave him everything, it said, and now he's taking the rest. By evening, the neighbors knew. I could tell by the way Mrs. Galloway across the street avoided eye contact while watering her plants. I saw 2 women walking their dogs pause in front of my mailbox, whispering. I wasn't paranoid. They had all seen the petition. It was public record. They thought they were being kind by pretending they hadn't. That's the worst kind of pity, the kind that disguises itself as distance. And so, when Camille knocked that night and said, "Do you need someone to go with you to court?" I didn't say yes because I was scared. I said yes because I was furious, because there comes a moment after humiliation and disbelief and grief when you cross into a new country, rage, not the kind that flares up and burns out, the kind that builds a house, files papers, does research, the kind that gets very, very quiet. I pulled out the leather folder I had saved since Derek died, the one he used for taxes and insurance, and I began sorting. I found the power of attorney form I'd revoked 5 years ago. I found bank statements showing every cent accounted for. I found the notarized letter from my accountant, confirming I had filed taxes myself through April. I made copies. I labeled envelopes. I did not sleep. In the morning, I called the courthouse, requested the hearing docket, and filed my intent to contest the conservatorship. They told me most people don't represent themselves. I told them I wasn't most people, and that is how the fight began. Not in a dramatic confrontation, not with shouting or slammed doors, but in the stillness of early morning, with a woman sitting at a kitchen table, surrounded by documents and silence, deciding not to vanish, not to go quietly, not to be rewritten by someone else's convenience, and not, under any circumstance, to hand over the keys to her own life. In the weeks leading up to the hearing, the world around me grew quieter, but not in a peaceful way. It was the quiet of surveillance, the quiet of rooms where someone has just left and taken the warmth with them, the kind of quiet that doesn't invite rest, but instead demands attention. I began to notice changes, small ones at first, like how my internet password no longer worked one morning, and when I called the provider, they told me the account holder had changed the login details for privacy reasons. I asked them who the account holder was, and they read me David's name. I thanked them politely, hung up, and took a walk around the block to keep my hands from shaking. When I came home, the front door was ajar, not wide, just cracked, as though someone had closed it behind them and forgot to listen for the click. I walked in slowly, instinctively lowering my footsteps the way I used to when the children were napping. Nothing looked out of place. No drawers were open, nothing on the floor. But I knew in that ancient way women do when something subtle but sacred has been touched without permission, that someone had been inside. I checked my study. My documents were still there, my folders untouched, but the desk lamp had been nudged slightly. I always left it angled toward the bookshelf. Now it faced the window. That was all, but it was enough. I called David. He didn't answer. I didn't leave a message. 2 hours later, I received a text from Marlene. Just a heads up, David stopped by earlier to check on a few things. Didn't want to wake you. I hadn't been asleep. I hadn't even left a note. Hope that's okay. The message ended. I didn't reply. What was the point? They weren't asking for permission. They were notifying me after the fact, as if I were a tenant, a guest, a fragile liability whose awareness was more obstacle than necessity. Things like that began to multiply. I woke one morning to find my medicine box rearranged, the lids closed but slightly off-kilter, like someone had opened and relabeled the compartments. When I confronted David over the phone, he sighed and said he'd asked a nurse friend of theirs to just take a look to make sure your dosages were still accurate. Some of your prescriptions are a little strong, Mom. I reminded him that I had been taking those same medications, with approval from my physician, for the past 5 years. Right, he said. But just in case. I started sleeping with the door locked, not that it would stop anyone if they were determined, but because it gave me a thread of control to hold on to in the dark. The worst part wasn't the fear. It was the gaslight flicker of doubt, the way I found myself wondering, just for a second, if maybe I had left the door unlocked, if maybe I had missed a dose, if maybe I was, in some small and invisible way, slipping. That's how it starts, not with confusion, but with isolation, not with forgetting, but with being forgotten, slowly, deliberately, until even you begin to question whether you were ever entirely whole. Camille noticed it before I could name it. She came by one afternoon with 2 cups of coffee and a bag of oranges. "You're losing weight," she said plainly, sitting on the edge of my sofa like someone who had long stopped asking permission to care. I told her about the internet password, the medicine box, the open door. I didn't cry. I laid it out like evidence at trial. She listened without interrupting, and then she said, "They're conditioning the room around you. They're softening the floor so when they pull it out, you won't hit it all at once." She offered to help me file a formal complaint against David, against the petition, against the conservatorship motion. But I shook my head. "I need to win this the right way," I said, "not as a victim." As a person who still knows how to read a calendar and write a sentence that matters, she didn't argue. She just stayed a little longer than usual, and when she left behind a small tape recorder with fresh batteries. "Just in case," she said, "say everything into it. Even if no one listens, at least you'll know it's real." I used it the very next day when the app on my phone, one David had convinced me to install for health monitoring, sent an alert to both of them saying I hadn't moved from the living room for 4 hours, which was true. I had been reading a biography of Eleanor Roosevelt. I'd gotten lost in it, underlining passages, sipping tea, watching the rain collect in streaks on the window. But 20 minutes later, Marlene arrived unannounced, letting herself in with a key I didn't know she had. "Just making sure everything's okay," she said, scanning the room like a prison warden on rounds. I told her she needed to call before visiting. She smiled and said, "You'll forget, and I don't want to worry you." I picked up the recorder from the arm of the chair, pressed the button, and said clearly into it, "This is Martha Harlow. The date is Thursday, June 4th, and my daughter-in-law entered my home without warning, using a key I did not give her, claiming to be concerned, but displaying no evidence of genuine urgency." Marlene stared at me like I'd slapped her. "What are you doing?" she asked. I smiled. "Recording." After that, the visit stopped, but so did the groceries. I'd been receiving automatic deliveries, pre-selected, prepaid, pre-approved. One week, they simply didn't arrive. When I called the store, they told me the payment method had been canceled. I used my own card, the one they didn't know about, the one with the name I kept in the back of my wallet just in case. When the delivery came the next day, I ordered things I hadn't had in months: spiced olives, fresh ginger, real cream. Things Marlene called frivolous the last time we'd cooked together. I placed them in the fridge like tiny declarations of independence. The house began to feel less like mine with every passing day. One morning, I found a camera installed above the porch, angled downward, small and matte black, easy to miss unless you knew where to look. There was no note, no explanation. I asked the neighbor across the street, who told me someone had come by while I was at the doctor's office. "A young man with a clipboard," she said, very polite. I disconnected the camera and placed it gently in a box by the door. When David called 2 days later to ask about the equipment, I told him I donated it. "To whom?" he asked. "To my sense of privacy," I said. He didn't laugh. At the library, I asked for a printout of all books I'd checked out in the past year. The librarian raised her eyebrows but obliged. I wanted a record, not for the court, but for myself. I wanted proof that my mind was still curious, still reaching. The list included fiction and nonfiction, poetry, politics, history, a manual on native plants, and a cookbook written entirely in French. I read every single one. Some I didn't understand all the way, but I made notes. I underlined. I participated. And isn't that the point? That we participate in our own lives, not simply endure them. By the time the hearing approached, I had stopped speaking to David and Marlene entirely. They still sent emails, soft threats wrapped in administrative language. We're hoping to resolve this without escalation. It's important for everyone to remain calm and reasonable. Let us know if you'd prefer to withdraw the objection. The tone was always the same, condescending, rehearsed, legalistic, and always from we, as though they were a unit, a team, and I was a faulty piece of machinery they were attempting to retire without causing scandal. But what they didn't understand, what they never saw coming, was that every quiet indignity, every subtle intrusion, every sentence that called me confused without using the word, was not weakening me. It was clarifying me. I was not unraveling. I was taking inventory. I was building a case not just in paperwork, but in willpower. Every day I woke up, made my own tea, selected my own clothes, opened my own doors, and named things by their real names: control, not care; erasure, not concern; theft, not help. And in doing so, I remembered who I was, not a woman losing her place in the world, but one who was about to take it back. I remember the moment the shift began, not with a declaration or dramatic act, but in the simple, stubborn ritual of remembering myself. It was raining that morning, not a heavy theatrical rain, but the slow, insistent kind that soaks the ground without asking. I sat by the window in the kitchen, same place as always, a chipped mug of tea beside me, the recorder resting on the table like a quiet companion. I'd just finished rereading a worn copy of The Year of Magical Thinking, and I underlined a passage I hadn't noticed before. Life changes in the instant. The ordinary instant. It struck me not because it was new, but because I finally understood it. My life had already changed, quietly, ruthlessly, in the accumulation of such ordinary instants. Passwords changed without consent, keys taken and replaced, groceries withheld, names stripped of warmth, affection repackaged as management. There had been no single explosion, no car crash, no slap across the face, only the slow grinding down of self until I was expected to nod, thank them, and vanish. But that morning, watching the rain turn the sidewalk silver, I realized I didn't owe them anything. Not my silence, not my forgiveness, and certainly not my surrender. I took a piece of paper from the drawer and began to write. Not a letter, not a list of complaints, but a statement, clear and unembellished. My name, my history, the facts of my condition, my cognitive capacity, my financial literacy, my independence. Not to prove it to them, but to remind myself that this wasn't a delusion. This wasn't me being difficult. It was a record of truth in my own handwriting, and that mattered more than any affidavit. I wrote for 2 hours, pausing only to refill my tea, and when I finished, I read it aloud to the empty room. My voice didn't shake. That same afternoon, Camille returned with a bag of plums and a folder under her arm. She wore her work scrubs and smelled faintly of disinfectant and rain. She sat across from me, peeled a plum with her fingers, and handed me the folder. "I talked to someone," she said. Inside was a packet of printouts, contacts for legal aid, elder rights groups, names of court-appointed advocates who had challenged conservatorship petitions before. I flipped through them slowly. "I don't want someone to speak for me," I said. "I want someone to help me be heard." Camille nodded. That's what I told them. Over the next week, we built something, an architecture of resistance, not grand or dramatic, but firm and precise. I wrote a declaration, and Camille helped me format it. We gathered documents, bills paid on time, letters written in clear language, records of completed library checkouts, and volunteer hours I'd quietly accumulated at the community garden. We created a timeline of incidents, not from memory alone, but from journals and receipts and digital timestamps. It felt strange, documenting your own sanity like you were building a resume to prove your existence. But it also felt empowering, in a way that startled me. To lay down the evidence of your own competence is to reclaim the territory of your own life. I wasn't fighting for freedom in the abstract. I was fighting for the right to choose what kind of tea I drank in the morning, what books I read, which coat I wore, and when I opened my front door. Camille was careful not to overstep. She never told me what to do. She asked questions. She listened. One night, as we sorted through files and labeled manila envelopes, she said quietly, "You know, this reminds me of my aunt. They did the same thing to her, only she didn't fight. She just gave up." I looked at her and said, "I don't know how to give up." And in that moment, I realized it was true. I had been raised in an era where you didn't scream unless you were bleeding. But I was learning, finally, deeply, that silence is not dignity. It's often the final prison. Something else happened that week. A neighbor, one I barely knew, slipped a card into my mailbox. No return address, no note, just a small ivory card with embossed letters. On the front, it read, "You are not alone." I didn't know who sent it. I didn't try to find out. But I taped it to my fridge, just below the magnet, shaped like a tulip my granddaughter made years ago. I looked at it every morning. I said it out loud, like a vow. I am not alone. I began preparing for the hearing like I used to prepare lesson plans, methodically, seriously, with more care than fear. I chose my outfit days in advance, a navy dress with a structured collar, the one I wore to Derek's retirement party, and a pair of low black heels that made my spine remember how to stand tall. I brushed my hair with intention. I applied lipstick, not for vanity, but as a shield. I organized my notes, labeled each folder, rehearsed my statement until the words became muscle memory. I recorded myself reading it and played it back while folding laundry, letting the sound of my own voice strengthen me. The night before the hearing, I didn't sleep much, but I didn't tremble either. I lay awake, listening to the wind against the windows, the creak of the walls, the familiar sounds of a house I still claimed as mine. I thought about all the women I'd taught over the years, the young girls who came to me with shaky essays and hidden brilliance, and I imagined them watching now. Not as students, but as witnesses. I wanted them to see that power is not always loud. Sometimes it is the quiet woman who refuses to vanish, who writes her own defense in longhand and walks into court with her spine straight and her heart open. I wanted them to know that aging is not a disappearance. It is another form of arrival. And when the morning came and I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of my dress, I looked at myself, not with judgment or nostalgia, but with clarity. My face was older, yes, softer in places, sharper in others, but my eyes were steady. My mind was mine. My life was still mine. I picked up my bag, slipped in the recorder, the folder, the statement. I didn't ask for luck. I didn't whisper prayers. I just said quietly, "Let them see me." And so the midpoint was not a courtroom scene. It was not a dramatic speech or a gavel banging. It was a woman standing in her kitchen, folding the sleeves of her coat, preparing not to prove she was worthy, but to insist that she already was. The shift wasn't a turn in the plot. It was a reclamation of voice, of self, of presence. And from that moment forward, I was no longer a defendant in their narrative. I was the author of my own. The morning of the hearing, the air felt too still, like the space between a question and an answer you already dread. I woke early, not from nerves, but because my body knew this was not an ordinary day. It was a day that had lived in the corner of my mind for weeks, growing heavier with every email, every voicemail, every carefully manipulated word from people who once kissed my cheeks and called me Mom. I dressed slowly, deliberately, as if preparing not for a battle, but for burial, a burial of illusion, of hope that things might still be resolved in private. I chose the navy dress again, the one with the collar that held its shape like an act of will, and pinned to it the old brooch Derek had given me on our 20th anniversary, a small silver circle with a single onyx stone in the center. It didn't match anything I wore. That's why I chose it. I wanted something of mine visible, unapologetically out of place. Camille arrived at 7:30, holding a thermos of coffee and a small envelope. She didn't say much. We didn't need to. The truth between women, especially women who have been dismissed, disbelieved, overlooked, doesn't require many words. In the envelope was a single printed photo. Me, seated at the community garden's seed exchange table, explaining the difference between heirloom and hybrid tomatoes to a group of teenagers. Someone had taken it without me knowing. Camille said, in case they forget who they're talking about today. I slipped it into my folder without a word, feeling something unfamiliar settle inside me. Not hope, not comfort, but steadiness. The courthouse was colder than I remembered from jury duty decades ago. The floors were tile, the walls lined with pamphlets about tenant rights, child custody, domestic mediation. No pamphlets for people like me. No pamphlets titled, How to Keep Your Life When Your Children Decide You're Inconvenient. We sat on a metal bench, Camille beside me, quiet, her hand resting lightly on her knee, ready. Across the hallway, I saw David. He stood beside Marlene, dressed in a navy suit and pale tie, holding a leather briefcase that looked too new to belong to someone who actually needed it. He didn't see me, or if he did, he didn't react. Marlene glanced in my direction once, then quickly looked away, as though I were something shameful, like a bill they couldn't pay, but had to keep receiving. My name was called, and I stood. I did not look at my son. I did not scan the room for kindness. I walked toward the hearing room as if I were walking into my own story, because I was. The judge was an older woman, her hair silver and cropped close, her voice crisp. I wondered briefly whether she had children, whether they still called her on holidays. The bailiff gestured to the defendant's area, a small glass-walled section with a door that clicked shut behind me. It was not a cage, not technically, but it had the same effect. I sat inside that transparent box like an exhibit. Elder woman, age 81, allegedly incapable. The glass muffled sound slightly, made everything feel distant. I could hear Camille speaking to the clerk, presenting our documents, her voice low but clear. And then I heard a woman's voice behind me, not loud, but sharp with judgment. She looks like a criminal. A whisper, not meant for me, but piercing all the same. I didn't turn. I just straightened my spine. David's attorney spoke first. A man I'd never met, young, expensive, confident in the way men are when they think they're doing something noble. He used words like intervention, concern, deterioration, and protective action. He referenced the clinical notes from a doctor who had never met me, who had reviewed reports compiled by Marlene and summarized my decompensation based on phone conversations. He played audio recordings out of context, one where I raised my voice after discovering my mailbox had been tampered with, another where I asked a delivery man to leave packages at the side entrance because I suspected someone was watching. These are the behaviors of someone experiencing cognitive decline, he said, not cruelly, but with a kind of dispassionate confidence, like reading a chart. Then he called Marlene to testify. She walked with composure. She wore beige. Of course she did. Her hair was pulled back tight, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She sat, looked at the judge, and spoke softly about her concerns. She said I had been erratic, difficult, at times verbally aggressive, that I refused medical check-ins, that I isolated myself. She cried once, on cue, not loudly, just a small, controlled tremble in her voice as she said, "We just want what's best for her." It's hard watching someone you love slip away. I stared at her, not blinking, and wondered whether she rehearsed the moment in the mirror that morning, whether she'd practiced which eye to dab with her tissue first. Then it was David's turn. My son, my boy. He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and spoke like a manager giving difficult news to an underperforming employee. He talked about my increasing confusion, about his fears that I might harm myself inadvertently, about financial instability and emotional volatility. "She's not the same anymore," he said. "She forgets things. She gets angry. She accuses people of things that didn't happen." The judge asked if he had any medical evidence of diagnosed cognitive impairment. He said, "Not officially, but we've observed the signs." Observed, not recorded, not confirmed, just observed, like a weather pattern, like mold. When it was my turn to speak, the judge motioned for the bailiff to unlock the glass enclosure. It took 3 seconds, 3 metallic clicks. But in those 3 seconds, I felt the weight of every woman who had ever been made to prove she deserved to be in the world she built. I stepped forward with my folder. I did not raise my voice. I did not tremble. I began with my name, my full name. I told the court how long I had lived independently, how I managed my affairs, how I had no debt, no diagnosed illness, no criminal record. I laid out documents, bills, receipts, letters of reference. I included the photo Camille had given me. I described in clear and specific detail the moments of manipulation, the small invasions, the erasures. I played my own recordings, not of rage, but of calm moments, clear speech, full sentences. I played the one where I asked Marlene to stop entering without permission, and she said, "You're lucky we still care." The courtroom was quiet, not sympathetic, not outraged, just quiet. The judge asked a few questions. I answered them plainly. When she asked why I believed this was happening, I said, "Because they want the house. Because managing me is easier than caring for me. Because it's easier to turn a woman into a patient than to face her as a person." I didn't cry, not even when David looked down at the floor, not even when Marlene clutched his hand like a drowning woman. I didn't cry because I had nothing left to weep over, only something to reclaim. Camille spoke briefly. She wasn't allowed to testify formally, but she submitted a letter. The judge read it silently. I watched her eyes pause on one sentence. She didn't read it aloud. But later, Camille told me what she wrote. She is not fragile. She is force-contained. When the judge delivered her decision, it was swift, almost anticlimactic. The petition for permanent conservatorship was denied. The temporary order was lifted. The motion was dismissed with prejudice, meaning it could not be refiled. She looked at David and said, "You may have legitimate concerns about your mother's aging, but concern is not control, and inconvenience is not incapacity." I walked out of that courtroom not triumphant, not victorious in the cinematic sense, but intact. I carried my folder like a shield. I didn't speak to David. He called out once, "Mom." I kept walking. Marlene turned away, already typing something on her phone. Maybe to her lawyer, maybe to her friends, maybe to no one. I didn't care. Camille was waiting at the bottom of the courthouse steps. She held my coat. "You free now?" she asked. I looked at the street, the sky, the light beginning to shift just slightly as the day leaned toward afternoon. "No," I said, "I'm just beginning." That was the second escalation, not because it was loud or chaotic, but because it forced me to face them fully, to hear their voices turn my life into a liability, to be reduced and repackaged and misnamed, and to answer not with apology, but with fact, memory, and voice. It was the moment their fantasy cracked, when their assumptions, their paperwork, their strategy met resistance that didn't shout, but stood, that didn't accuse, but witnessed. And in that room, behind glass and under oath, I did not disappear. I did not retreat. I remained. It wasn't over when the judge dismissed the case. I wish I could tell you that it ended in that courtroom, that I walked down those marble steps and never looked back, that the sound of the bailiff unlocking that glass door somehow erased everything that came before. But real freedom doesn't arrive in a moment. It arrives in a series of quiet, irreversible choices. That's what they never understood, David and Marlene. They thought the court was the battlefield, the final act, the place where the outcome would be decided. But the real act of reclaiming my life came after, in what I chose to do when the spotlight was gone, when there were no transcripts being typed and no judge to speak for me. The law had sided with me, but my life was still mine to salvage, and the wreckage they left behind didn't come with a map or a manual. A week after the hearing, I went to the house I had called home for over 30 years and began packing, not as a punishment to them, not as surrender, but as declaration. I didn't want to live in a place where every light switch felt like a surveillance tool, where the walls held whispers I couldn't unhear. They had turned my home into a site of war, small, strategic invasions masked as concern, kindness, precaution. I couldn't scrub their fingerprints from the door frames. I couldn't unknow the way it felt to find my belongings rearranged, my silence interpreted as incompetence. So I chose something they never expected. I left. It took me 4 days to sort what I would keep. Most of it was paper. I threw away every cardigan Marlene had bought me for Christmas, every scented candle labeled calm or rest or home. I kept the books, the letters Derek wrote me during our first year of marriage, the hand-drawn birthday cards from my grandchildren before they learned to write in cursive. I left behind the oak table David insisted we replace after Derek's death. Too big for one person, he'd said. I sold it, bought a smaller one that fits just me and a guest. That felt like enough. I moved to a town 2 hours south where no one knew me and no one asked questions. The rental was small, with uneven floors and a view of the sea that made everything else forgivable. I bought new curtains. I chose yellow. I had never allowed myself yellow curtains before. Always neutral, always quiet, always thinking of resale value or appearances. But now I chose the loudest, warmest yellow I could find. I put them up myself, teetering on a step stool, laughing when I almost fell. No one told me to sit down. No one reached to take the drill from my hand. I was alone, and I was capable. But the real climax didn't happen in court or in the act of moving. It happened one Tuesday afternoon when a letter arrived. Handwritten from David. No return address, no salutation, just a few careful lines on cream paper. I'm sorry if it felt like we were trying to take something from you. That wasn't our intention. We were scared. We thought we were helping. I hope you're safe. I hope you're okay. There was no signature, just D. I sat with the letter for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't throw it away. I didn't write back. Instead, I walked to the edge of the beach and let the wind undo my hair. I thought about all the years I spent worrying about being a good mother, a good wife, a reasonable woman, someone who didn't make trouble, someone who made herself small enough to fit inside other people's expectations. And then I thought about that cage, the glass, the whispers, the lie dressed up as help. And I said quietly but aloud, "You don't get to apologize for theft and call it fear." The next day, I went to the county clerk's office and filed 3 documents. The first was a change of address for all official records. The second was a revocation of the shared medical proxy David still didn't know had been quietly reactivated through a loophole. The third was a notarized letter to my attorney requesting that my will be amended, names removed, assets redirected, a new executor appointed, not out of spite, out of precision, out of clarity, out of a need to draw the line not in sand, but in stone. And that truly was the climax, not a scream, not a confrontation, not the slamming of a door, but the calm, deliberate crossing of a threshold, a point beyond which I would never again ask for permission to own my own life. That's what they never saw coming. They prepared for resistance, but they didn't prepare for my exit. They planned to manage me, not to lose me. But I was not lost. I was walking forward, with my name intact, my mind clear, my choices sharpened into declarations no judge had to affirm. Some women reclaim their power with speeches, some with silence. I reclaim mine with yellow curtains, with sea air, with the line in that courtroom when I said, "Concern is not control." With every day I spend now not proving I'm competent, but simply living as though I never stopped being whole, because I didn't. They just stopped looking for the evidence, but I never misplaced it. So no, the climax wasn't public. It wasn't noisy. It was the letter left unanswered, the locks changed without ceremony, the email accounts deleted. The family group chat exited without a goodbye. It was the moment I stopped defending myself and started building something new, out of reach, out of obligation, out of their version of love. That, for me, was the final act of resistance. Not forgiveness, not revenge, just departure, a clean, silent, permanent walking away. The door didn't slam behind me. It stayed open, but I didn't look back. I don't expect him to write again. I don't expect a phone call on my birthday, or a message on Mother's Day, or the soft, guilty apology some women wait their entire lives to hear. I no longer build my days around the absence of what should have been. I water the plants. I sit by the window in the early mornings and watch the sea change its mind every hour. I speak to people who know me only as I am now, not as I was in their childhood or in their crisis. And there is something profoundly liberating about being seen with no history attached, just the evidence of who you are when you are no longer trying to prove anything. Some nights, I think about the version of me they tried to invent, the woman who couldn't be trusted with her own keys, whose opinions were symptoms, whose preferences were considered threats. I imagine her sitting quietly in that glass box, nodding politely while decisions are made around her, being called sweetheart by strangers who don't mean kindness, only diminishment. And I want to reach through that glass and tell her, "You were never the problem. You were the warning. There are still shadows. I won't pretend otherwise." There are moments, especially in the quiet before sleep, when my mind drifts back to the dull ache of betrayal. Not the betrayal itself, but the ease of it, the efficiency. How calmly they signed papers, submitted petitions, labeled me as liability, as burden, as story, to be rewritten for their convenience. It stings less than it did, but it stings, and I let it, because that sting reminds me that I am still here, still intact, still capable of feeling everything they tried to muffle into silence. I volunteer now at a small library near the edge of town. Twice a week, I sit at the help desk and recommend books to strangers. Some come for novels, some for cookbooks, some for maps. I learn their names. They learn mine. No one asks what I used to be. No one presumes what I can or cannot do. I stamp the dates. I shelve the returns. I mend the broken spines, and I do it with hands that once shook with rage, but now move with something steadier, ownership. One woman, a few years younger than me, came in last month with papers trembling in her hand. Her daughter had filed for control of her bank account after a minor surgery, claiming she was financially compromised. She looked at me like someone looking for a crack in a wall, a way through. I listened. I didn't advise. But before she left, I said, make copies of everything, date every conversation, speak like you're being recorded, and don't wait for someone to believe you. Believe yourself first. She nodded like someone remembering how to breathe. I know I won't live forever. I don't say that in fear. I say it as a woman who knows the value of what remains. Every morning I wake up without having to explain myself to anyone is a gift no one can take back. I make tea. I write letters I don't send. I laugh louder than I used to because no one is there to tell me to be careful. I wear red lipstick to the market, not because it's flattering, but because I like how it looks on the rim of my cup, because it reminds me that the body is not a burden. It is a vessel of choice. And if I could say one thing to another woman sitting where I once sat, on the edge of being erased, I would say this: do not confuse quiet for safety. Do not let their worry become your cage. You are not too much. You are not mistaken. You are not in decline. You are simply no longer useful to those who only know how to love when they are needed. And that is not your failure. That is theirs. I keep the glass paperweight they gave me on my last birthday before the petition, before the war in slow motion began. It's just a sphere, nothing inscribed, heavy and clear. Sometimes I hold it in my hand, feel the weight of it, how easily it could break something if dropped. And I think, yes, this too is me, heavy, clear, unbreakable, if I choose not to fall. And I don't. Not anymore.